Sometimes the people we help change our lives forever, and sometimes they save it. There are moments when a single decision in the wilderness can mean the difference between going home safely or never going home at all. Leona Briggs knew these Colorado mountains like an old friend. She'd walked these trails for over 40 years, gathering herbs and living peacefully among the tall pines. But on this foggy morning, she found a bleeding stranger sitting against a tree. His name was Carter Vance, a wanted outlaw with a reputation that stretched across 3 states. When she approached him, he didn't beg for help. Instead, he looked past her into the forest and whispered words that made her blood run cold. "Don't talk." What had this dangerous man seen in her quiet woods that scared him more than being caught? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine needles like memories that refused to fade. Leona Briggs adjusted the worn leather strap of her gathering basket and stepped carefully over the moss-covered rocks that marked the old deer path. At 43, she moved through these Colorado mountains with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned every secret the wilderness held, or so she had believed until this moment. The stranger slumped against the ancient oak her grandfather had called the Sentinel, his dark hair matted with blood and pine sap. His clothes, though torn and stained, spoke of quality, a city man's idea of what one wore to the frontier. But it was his eyes that held her attention. They weren't the desperate, pleading eyes of a man seeking help. They were the watchful, calculating eyes of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to leave this place, now." Leona had lived alone on this mountain for 15 years, ever since her husband Thomas had died in the mine accident that took half the men in Copper Creek. She had learned to read danger in the set of a man's shoulders, the tension in his jaw, the way his hand rested near his weapon. This man was dangerous, certainly, but not to her. "Not right now. You're bleeding," she said, setting down her basket. "That wound needs tending. Did you hear what I said?" His hand moved to the gun at his hip, not as a threat, but as reassurance. "This isn't a place for—" A sound drifted through the trees, low and rumbling, like distant thunder, but wrong somehow. Too rhythmic, too deliberate. The stranger's face went pale, and his grip tightened on his revolver. "Don't talk," he whispered urgently, pressing his finger to his lips. "Whatever you do, don't make a sound." Leona had heard many things in these woods over the years. The whistle of wind through the canyon, the crack of settling timber, the occasional rock slide echoing up from the old mine workings. But this was different. This sounded almost like voices, many voices speaking in unison, too far away to make out words, but close enough to send ice through her veins. The sound faded, leaving only the normal chorus of morning birds and rustling leaves. The stranger's breathing gradually slowed, but his eyes never stopped scanning the tree line. "My name is Leona Briggs," she said quietly. "This is my land." He studied her for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. "Carter Vance," he said finally. "And if this is your land, ma'am, then you're in more danger than you know." She had heard the name before. Carter Vance, wanted for robbery, assault, and murder across 3 territories. The kind of man decent people crossed the street to avoid. But looking at him now, slumped and bleeding beneath her grandfather's oak, she saw something else. Fear. Real, bone-deep terror of whatever had made that sound in the forest. "Can you walk?" she asked. "Mom, you don't understand. I understand that you're bleeding all over my grandfather's favorite tree. And if you stay here much longer, you'll either bleed to death or whatever you're afraid of will find you." She picked up her basket and slung it across her shoulder. "My cabin's a quarter-mile up the ridge. Can you make it?" Carter pushed himself away from the tree, wincing as he put weight on his left leg. A dark stain spread across his pants just above the knee. "Why would you help me? You know who I am. I know what people say you are." Leona started up the trail, not looking back to see if he followed. "I also know that a man running from something that scares him worse than a hangman's noose might have good reason." Her cabin sat in a clearing her grandfather had carved from the forest 40 years ago. The logs were still solid, chinked tight against the mountain winters, with a stone chimney that drew clean and windows that faced east to catch the morning light. A vegetable garden sprawled along the south side, and herbs hung drying from the covered porch. It was a simple life, but it was hers. Carter collapsed into the chair beside her kitchen table while she gathered supplies from the shelves lined with jars and bottles. Her grandmother had taught her the healing arts, knowledge passed down through generations of mountain women who lived too far from towns to rely on doctors. "This will hurt," she warned, cleaning the wound on his leg. The bullet had passed through the meaty part of his thigh, missing the bone, but leaving a ragged hole that would take time to heal. "I've had worse," he said through gritted teeth. "Ma'am, Leona, you need to know something about this mountain, about what's down in those mine shafts." She worked in silence, stitching the wound with practiced efficiency. Her grandfather had been one of the men who first opened the Copper Creek mine back in 1882. She had grown up on stories of the early days, when copper ore came out of the mountain by the wagon load and the future seemed bright as a new penny. "My grandfather used to work those mines," she said, tying off the last stitch. "Before they sealed them up," Carter's head snapped up. "Sealed them when?" "After the accident. 1882. Cave-in killed 16 men, including my great-uncle Samuel." She began wrapping the wound with clean bandages. "They said the mine was too dangerous to continue working. They lied." Carter's voice was flat, certain. "Those mines weren't sealed because of a cave-in. They were sealed because of what the miners found down there." Leona tied off the bandage and sat back in her chair. Through the window, she could see the old mine entrance, nothing more than a dark mouth in the hillside below, overgrown with 40 years of brush and vines. She had played near it as a child until her grandfather caught her and gave her the worst switching of her life. "Some places are meant to stay closed," he had told her. "Some doors shouldn't be open, not ever. What kind of work brings a man like you to an abandoned mine?" she asked. Carter was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at something she couldn't see. "The kind that pays well enough to make a man forget his better judgment," he said finally. "I was hired to survey the old workings, map the tunnels, assess the structural integrity. Client said they were thinking about reopening the mine. And what did you find?" His laugh held no humor. "I found out why it was sealed in the first place. And I found out that some things are better left buried." From somewhere deep in the mountain came that sound again, distant voices speaking in rhythm, rising and falling like a tide. Carter went rigid, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "How long has that been happening?" he asked. Leona frowned. She had noticed strange sounds from the mountain over the past few weeks, but she had attributed them to settling rock, or perhaps animals in the old mine shafts. "A month, maybe 2. "I thought it was just—" "It's not," Carter said grimly. "And it's getting stronger." She studied his face, seeing the truth there, even if she couldn't understand it. "What's down there, Mr. Vance?" Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed up from the valley below. Carter was on his feet instantly, despite his wounded leg, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to trouble. "Riders," he said. 3 of them coming up the main trail." Leona joined him at the window. Through the trees, she could see the dust cloud raised by fast-moving horses. "Could be travelers looking for directions. Sometimes folks get lost trying to find the pass. Ma'am, I hate to tell you this, but men don't ride that hard through mountain country unless they're chasing something." Carter checked his revolver, spinning the cylinder to ensure it was loaded. Or someone. The riders came into view as they reached the clearing. Hard men with hard faces, wearing the kind of clothes that said they were comfortable with violence. The one in the lead, a tall man with a silver badge pinned to his vest, called out as he approached the cabin. "Mrs. Briggs. Sheriff Tom Morrison from Copper Creek. We're looking for a dangerous fugitive. Wondered if you might have seen anyone unusual in these parts." Leona glanced at Carter, who had pressed himself against the wall beside the window, out of sight but ready to move. She could turn him in right now, collect whatever reward was on his head, and go back to her quiet life. It would be the sensible thing to do. Instead, she opened the door and stepped onto the porch. "Morning, Sheriff. Can't say I've seen anyone. What kind of dangerous are we talking about?" "Armed robbery, murder, the usual." Morrison's eyes swept the clearing, taking in every detail. "Man named Carter Vance, last seen heading this direction after a shootout in Black Hawk." "I'll keep an eye out," Leona said. "Anything else I should know about this fellow?" One of the other riders spoke up. "He's wounded. Took a bullet in the leg during the chase. Won't get far on foot in this terrain." Morrison nodded. "You see anything at all, you send word to town right away. Don't try to handle him yourself. This is a killing man, Mrs. Briggs." "I understand, Sheriff." The lawmen turned their horses and rode back down the trail, but Leona noticed they didn't head toward town. Instead, they took the path that led deeper into the mountains, toward the old mine workings. She closed the door and found Carter watching her with something like gratitude in his eyes. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because a man doesn't get that scared of empty mine shafts," she said. "And because those weren't lawmen." "What makes you say that?" "Sheriff Morrison died 3 years ago. Heart attack. I was at his funeral." Leona moved to her rifle rack and took down her grandfather's old Winchester. "So whoever those men were, they weren't here to arrest you. They were here to make sure you stayed quiet about what you found down there." Carter sank back into his chair, the weight of understanding settling over him like a shroud. "Then we're both in trouble now. Because they're not going to just ride away and forget about this place." From deep within the mountain came that strange sound again, louder this time and somehow closer. Through the window, Leona could see birds taking flight from the trees near the mine entrance. "As if something had disturbed them." "Mr. Vance," she said quietly, "I think it's time you told me exactly what you found down there." But before Carter could answer, the sound changed. What had been rhythmic voices became something else, a low, hungry growling that seemed to come from the very stones of the mountain itself. And in that moment, Leona understood that her quiet life on the mountain was over, whether she wanted it to be or not. The growing that rose from the mountain's depths faded slowly, like an echo trapped in stone. Carter sat forward in his chair, every muscle tense, while Leona kept her rifle ready and her eyes on the tree line. Whatever those fake lawmen were really after, they hadn't given up and ridden away. "Start talking," Leona said quietly. "What did you find down there?" Carter ran a hand through his dark hair, leaving streaks of dried blood on his forehead. 3 weeks ago, a man named Josiah Blackwood hired me to survey the Copper Creek mine. Said his company was interested in reopening it, extracting whatever copper ore might be left. And you believed him? The money was real enough. $500 just to map the tunnels and assess structural integrity. For a man with a price on his head, that kind of work seemed like a gift. Carter's laugh was bitter. "Should have known better." Leona moved to the window, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. "What happened when you went down there?" "First day was normal enough. Old tunnels, mostly stable, some cave-ins, but nothing unexpected. The mine went deeper than I thought, at least 3 levels, maybe more. But it was on the second day that I found the sealed section. Sealed how? Stone wall, maybe 6 feet thick, fitted so tight you could barely see the joints. Professional work meant to last. But someone had been working on it recently. New tool marks, fresh rubble. They'd opened a hole just big enough for a man to crawl through. The sound came again from the mountain, closer now and definitely not natural. Leona had hunted these woods since she was old enough to carry a rifle, and she knew every sound the mountain made. This was something else entirely. "Did you go through the hole?" she asked. Carter nodded grimly. Blackwood's orders were specific. Map everything, no matter how deep or dangerous. So I went through. He was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. The tunnel on the other side was different, older, not carved by miners with picks and shovels. "What do you mean?" "The walls were smooth, almost polished, and there were markings carved into the stone, symbols I'd never seen before. The tunnel sloped down for maybe 200 feet, then opened into a chamber. Leona felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What kind of chamber?" "Big as a church, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. But it wasn't empty. Carter's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. There were bones, Leona, human bones. Dozens of skeletons arranged in a circle around something in the center. What was in the center? Before Carter could answer, a sharp crack echoed from the forest, the sound of a branch breaking under weight. Both of them froze, listening. Through the window, Leona could see movement in the trees below the cabin. Shadows that seemed to move against the natural flow of wind through the branches. "They're back," Carter breathed, but these weren't the fake lawmen on horseback. These shapes moved differently, flowing between the trees with an unnatural grace that made Leona's skin crawl. She counted at least 4 figures, maybe more, circling the cabin with the patience of predators. "What did you see in the center of that chamber?" She whispered urgently. "An altar," Carter said. "Stone carved with the same symbols as the tunnel walls. And on top of it," he stopped, his face going pale. "God help me, there was something wrapped in burial cloth, something that shouldn't have been there." The shapes in the forest had stopped moving. Now they stood motionless among the trees, watching the cabin with an attention that felt almost tangible. Leona could make out more details now, tall figures in dark clothing, but something was wrong with the way they stood. "The way they held themselves, Carter," she said slowly. "Are those the same men who were chasing you?" He looked out the window and went rigid. "No, those aren't men at all." One of the figures stepped forward into the clearing, and Leona's breath caught in her throat. It had the general shape of a man, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung too long at its sides. Its face was hidden in shadow, but she could see the gleam of eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. "Guardians," Carter said. "That's what Blackwood called them. He said they were the reason the mine was sealed in the first place." More figures emerged from the trees, forming a loose circle around the cabin. Now Leona could see there were at least 8 of them, all with that same wrong-proportioned shape, all watching with those gleaming eyes. "Your grandfather's journal," Carter said suddenly. "The one on the shelf there. Have you ever read it?" Leona glanced at the worn leather book that had sat on her kitchen shelf for as long as she could remember. "Those are just mining records. Boring stuff about ore yields and tunnel depths. Look at the entries from late 1882, the weeks before the mine was sealed." She grabbed the journal and flipped through the pages, scanning her grandfather's careful handwriting. Most of it was exactly what she expected. Technical notes about mining operations, lists of equipment, records of ore extracted. But as she reached the final entries, dated in October 1882, the handwriting became increasingly erratic. "October 15th, she read aloud. "Broke through to the old workings today. Samuel says we should turn back, but the copper vein runs deep. Strange sounds from below. The figures outside had begun to move again, but not toward the cabin. They seemed to be herding something, driving it up from the direction of the mine." Leona felt her stomach clench as she continued reading. October 18th. "Lost 3 men in the deep tunnel. They went down to investigate the sounds and never came back. Found their tools scattered near the sealed wall. The wall Samuel's grandfather told us never to breach." "Keep reading," Carter urged, his eyes fixed on the creatures outside. "October 22nd. They took Samuel in the night. Found him this morning arranged with the others in that cursed chamber. His eyes, God forgive me, his eyes were still open, still aware. The things that guard this place, they don't kill. They collect." Leona's hands trembled as she turned the page. The final entry was dated October 24th, 1882. "Sealed the tunnel today. Used every man left alive and all the dynamite we could spare. May God forgive us for what we've done, but better to bury the truth than let it walk the earth. If anyone reads this, know that some doors should never be opened. Some hungers should never be fed. The Copper Creek mine is closed forever, and it must stay that way." A child's scream pierced the morning air, high and terrified, coming from somewhere near the mine entrance. Leona's blood turned to ice as she recognized the voice. Little Emma Tucker from the valley, who sometimes wandered up the mountain looking for wildflowers. "Dear God," she breathed. "There's a child down there." The creatures outside turned toward the sound as one, their attention shifting away from the cabin. Without hesitation, Leona grabbed her rifle and headed for the door. "Wait!" Carter called after her. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. I understand that there's a little girl in danger." She paused at the door, looking back at him. "Are you coming with me, or are you going to sit there and bleed on my furniture?" Carter struggled to his feet, favoring his wounded leg, but managing to stand. "Those things, they're not going to just let us walk down there. Then we'll have to convince them." Leona checked her rifle and stepped onto the porch. One way or another, the creatures had formed a line between the cabin and the mine entrance, no longer trying to hide among the trees. In the daylight, they were even more unsettling, humanoid but elongated, with skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved with a fluid grace that suggested they were more comfortable in darkness than in the open air. Emma's scream came again, weaker this time, but still audible. Somewhere down in those tunnels, a frightened child was trapped with whatever had been awakened when the sealed chamber was opened. "The journal mentioned dynamite," Carter said, joining her on the porch. "Do you have any explosives?" "My grandfather's old cache is still in the tool shed. But if we bring down those tunnels, we might be the only chance that little girl has." Carter checked his revolver, counting bullets. "Because those things aren't going to let her leave. Not alive." One of the creatures stepped forward, and for the first time, Leona could see its face clearly. It had once been human. The basic features were still recognizable, but something had changed it, stretched it, made it into something else. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "Leave," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "This place is not for the living." "There's a child down there," Leona called back. "We're taking her home." The creature tilted its head, considering her words. "She belongs to the deep places now, as will you if you do not leave." Carter raised his gun. "We're going down there. You can get out of our way, or we can go through you." The creatures began to move, flowing down the hillside with that unnatural grace, no longer content to simply watch and wait. Emma's scream echoed up from the mine one more time, and then there was only silence. Leona shouldered her rifle and started down the path. "Then I guess we go through them." The first creature moved like liquid shadow, covering the distance between the trees and the cabin porch in 3 impossibly long strides. Leona's rifle cracked, the bullet catching the thing's center mass and spinning it around, but it didn't fall. Dark fluid leaked from the wound, but the creature straightened and kept coming. "Aim for the head," Carter shouted, his revolver barking twice in quick succession. One shot went wide, but the second took the creature in the temple, dropping it like a felled tree. "That works better," Leona muttered. Working the bolt of her Winchester, the remaining creatures spread out, no longer advancing in a straight line, but moving to flank them from multiple directions. Their movements were coordinated, intelligent. Whatever these things had once been, they retained enough human cunning to hunt as a pack. Carter limped down from the porch, using a fence post to steady himself. "We need to reach that mine entrance before they cut us off completely." "The tool shed first," Leona said, backing toward the small wooden structure behind her cabin. "If we're going down there, we'll need light and explosives." A creature emerged from behind the shed, moving to block their path. This one was different from the others, smaller, more recently changed. Leona recognized the clothes, the build, even the face beneath the unnatural stretching. "Samuel Tucker," she breathed. "Emma's father." The thing that had been Samuel Tucker opened its mouth and spoke in a voice like grinding gravel. "She called for me. In the darkness below. I had to go to her. Where is Emma now?" Leona demanded, keeping her rifle trained on the creature. "Safe. Waiting. Soon she will understand, as I understand." Samuel took a step closer. "As you will understand when the change comes." Carter put a bullet through Samuel's forehead, and the creature collapsed without another word. "Whatever happened to him, it's not going to happen to us." Leona pushed through the tool shed door, grabbing an oil lantern and a canvas bag that rattled with the sound of dynamite sticks. Her grandfather had been careful with his explosives, storing them properly wrapped and separated from the blasting caps. She grabbed both, along with a coil of fuse wire. "How well do you know those mine tunnels?" she asked Carter as they emerged from the shed. Well enough. The main shaft goes down about 200 feet, then branches into 3 separate tunnels. The sealed chamber is at the end of the easternmost branch. He reloaded his revolver, hands steady, despite the pain in his leg. But there are other passages I didn't map. Older ones. The remaining creatures had repositioned themselves in a loose semicircle, still blocking the direct path to the mine, but no longer advancing. They seemed content to watch and wait, as if they knew something their quarry didn't. They're herding us, Leona realized, driving us toward the mine entrance. Maybe that's where we need to go anyway, not the way they want us to go. Leona studied the hillside, looking for an alternative route. There's an old service tunnel about 50 yards to the north. My grandfather used it to bring equipment down from the upper workings. If it's still open, we can reach the main shaft without going through their trap. The service tunnel entrance was partially concealed by 40 years of brush and rockfall, but the opening was still passable. Leona lit the oil lantern and led the way into the narrow passage, Carter following close behind. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, carved roughly through solid rock. This connects to the main shaft about halfway down, she explained, her voice echoing in the confined space. We should be able to... A sound echoed up from the depths below, Emma's voice, but wrong somehow. Too calm, too measured for a frightened child. Papa? Papa, where are you? I'm waiting in the special place. Carter grabbed Leona's arm. That's not her. Not anymore. What do you mean? I've heard that voice before. Down in the sealed chamber. It's how they call to you, make you want to come deeper. His face was grim in the lantern light. Emma's been down there too long. The tunnel opened into the main mine shaft, a circular chamber carved from living rock, with passages leading off in 3 directions. Ancient timbers still supported the ceiling, though many showed signs of rot and stress. The air was thick with the smell of dampness and something else, something organic and unpleasant. The easternmost tunnel, Carter pointed toward the darkest of the 3 passages. That's where I found the sealed chamber. Emma's voice drifted up from that direction, still calling for her father with that unnaturally calm tone. But there were other sounds now. The scrape of movement in the darkness, the whisper of fabric against stone. How many of those things are down here? Leona asked. I don't know. I only saw 3 or 4 when I first explored, but that was before... Carter stopped, listening to something she couldn't hear. Before they started collecting people. They moved deeper into the easternmost tunnel, following the oil lantern's flickering light. The walls here showed signs of recent excavation, fresh tool marks and scattered rubble where someone had been widening the passage. At one point, they passed a pile of mining equipment that looked like it had been there for decades. This is where I found the first skeleton, Carter said quietly. Still wearing his mining gear from 1882. The tunnel began to slope more steeply, and the air grew noticeably warmer. Strange symbols were carved into the walls at regular intervals, spirals and angular patterns that seemed to shift and move in the lantern light. Do you know what these mean? Leona asked. Blackwood claimed they were Native American, but I've never seen anything like them before. Carter traced one of the symbols with his finger. They're old, though. Much older than the mine. Emma's voice came again, closer now, but still with that eerie calm. I found the pretty room, Papa. Come see the pretty room. The tunnel opened into the chamber Carter had described, a vast circular space with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. Bones littered the floor, arranged in careful patterns that spiraled inward toward the center. Some were old and yellowed with age, but others looked disturbingly fresh. At the center of the chamber stood a stone altar carved with the same symbols as the tunnel walls. And sitting on top of the altar, her small legs dangling over the edge, was Emma Tucker. She looked exactly as she had when Leona last saw her in town, 7 years old with blonde pigtails and a bright blue dress, except for her eyes. Her eyes reflected the lantern light like an animal's, and when she smiled, her teeth seemed too sharp. Miss Leona, Emma called out cheerfully. Did you come to see the pretty room too? Leona took a step forward, but Carter caught her arm. Don't, he warned. Look at the altar. The stone surface beneath Emma was covered with dark stains, old blood, and something else that glistened wetly in the lantern light. And wrapped in burial cloth at the base of the altar was the shape Carter had described, roughly human, but too long and too thin. "What is that thing?" Leona whispered. "I think it's what they're trying to wake up," Carter said. "And Emma's the final piece they need." The wrapped figure stirred slightly, as if responding to their voices. One long arm emerged from the burial cloth, fingers ending in claws that scraped against the stone. Emma giggled, the sound echoing strangely in the vast chamber. "He's almost ready to play." Papa said, "I just have to wait a little longer and then we can all be together forever." From the tunnel behind them came the sound of movement, slow, deliberate footsteps approaching through the darkness. The creatures from above had found the service tunnel and were coming down to join the reunion. "We need to get Emma and get out of here," Leona said, raising her rifle. "And how exactly do you propose we do that?" Carter asked. "She's sitting on top of whatever they're trying to resurrect. And we're about to be trapped between it and them." The wrapped figure on the altar sat up slowly, burial cloth falling away to reveal a face that had once been human but was now something else entirely. Its eyes opened, glowing with a pale light that cast strange shadows on the chamber walls. Emma clapped her hands together in delight. "He's awake! He's finally awake!" The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and it spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "So long have I slept, so long have I hungered. But now the feast begins." Leona shouldered her rifle. But before she could fire, Emma suddenly looked directly at her, with eyes that were completely, desperately human. "Miss Leona," the little girl whispered, her voice breaking with terror. "Please help me. I can't move. I can't get down. Something's holding me here." Then the human light in her eyes flickered and died, replaced once again by that unnatural glow. "But I don't want to leave," she said in her calm, wrong voice. "This is where I belong now." The footsteps in the tunnel were getting closer. The ancient creature on the altar stretched its limbs, joints popping like breaking kindling after decades of stillness. Its pale eyes fixed on Leona and Carter with an intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly focused. "Two more for the collection," it said, its voice echoing from the stone walls. "How thoughtful of my servants to bring them directly to me." Carter raised his revolver, but the creature moved faster than anything that old and decrepit had a right to. One clawed hand swept out, knocking the gun from his grip and sending it clattering across the bone-strewn floor. Now, the creature chided, settling back onto the altar with Emma still perched beside it like a grotesque doll. "There's no need for violence. Soon you'll understand that this is exactly where you're meant to be." The footsteps in the tunnel had reached the chamber entrance. 3 of the transformed creatures emerged from the darkness, moving with that same fluid grace, but now showing clear deference to the thing on the altar. They arranged themselves in a semicircle, blocking any retreat. Leona kept her rifle trained on the ancient creature, but she could see the intelligence in its eyes, calculating her next move before she made it. "What do you want?" she demanded. "Want?" The creature tilted its head, considering the question. "I want what any being wants after sleeping for centuries in the cold dark. I want to feel the sun on my face again. I want to walk the green world above. I want to taste properly prepared food instead of subsisting on the offerings my faithful servants bring me." It gestured to the bones scattered around the chamber, and Leona's stomach turned as she realized what kind of offerings it meant. "But mostly," the creature continued, "I want my children to thrive and multiply. For too long, they've been confined to these tunnels, limited to the occasional wanderer or foolish treasure hunter. But with the proper catalyst," its eyes fixed on Emma, who sat motionless and glassy-eyed beside it, "they can spread throughout the territory. Every town, every settlement, every isolated farmstead." Carter had been slowly edging toward where his revolver had fallen. "And Emma's the catalyst?" Innocent blood, freely given through a child's trust. "It's the final component needed to complete the transformation ritual." The creature's clawed hand rested gently on Emma's shoulder, almost paternal if you ignored the fact that the touch was slowly draining the color from her skin. "She came to me willingly, you see," called by her father's voice, led down into the darkness by love and concern. "You used her father as bait," Leona said, her finger tightening on the rifle's trigger. "I use whatever tools are available. Samuel Tucker was exploring these tunnels weeks ago, searching for his lost cattle. He made such delightful sounds when the change took him." The creature's smile revealed far too many teeth, just as his daughter will, when her transformation is complete. Emma's head turned toward them with jerky, unnatural movements. When she spoke, her voice was layered, her own childish tones overlaid with something ancient and hungry. "Miss Leona, why won't you come closer? I want to show you the pretty pictures on the walls." For the first time, Leona noticed the symbols carved into the chamber walls weren't just decorative. They seemed to be moving, writhing like living things in the lantern light. As she watched, they began to pulse with the same pale glow as the creature's eyes. "The old warnings," Carter breathed, recognizing something in the patterns. "These aren't just random symbols. They're a binding ritual." "Very good," the creature said approvingly. "Your people called my kind many names over the centuries. Demons, spirits, the hungry dead. But we are simply what we are. The first inhabitants of this land. Driven deep by those who feared what they couldn't understand." The symbols pulsed brighter, and Leona felt a strange tugging sensation, as if something invisible was trying to pull her forward toward the altar. She planted her feet and resisted, but the pull grew stronger. "The binding grows stronger with each sacrifice," the creature explained. "Each life, freely given, weakens the barriers between our realm and yours. Soon my children will walk freely in the world above, and the living will learn to serve as they were always meant to." Carter lunged for his fallen revolver, but one of the transformed creatures intercepted him, long arms wrapping around his chest and lifting him off his feet. He struggled against the inhuman grip, but the thing holding him was far stronger than any living man. "Carter!" Leona swung her rifle toward his captor, but the moment she took her attention off the ancient creature, it moved, faster than thought. It flowed from the altar to stand directly in front of her, one clawed hand closing around the rifle barrel. The metal began to smoke and warp under its touch, the heat so intense she had to let go or have her hands burned. "Such fire," the creature said admiringly. "Such determination to protect those you care about. You'll make an excellent addition to my collection." "I'm not going to be part of anything," Leona snarled, reaching for the dynamite in her bag. The creature's other hand shot out, grasping her wrist with a grip like iron. Where its claws touched her skin, she felt a cold numbness spreading up her arm. "The change doesn't hurt," it said gently. "In fact, most find it quite liberating. All that human emotion, all that fear and uncertainty gone, replaced with purpose, with belonging, with the joy of serving something greater than yourself." The numbness was spreading faster now, reaching her shoulder. Leona could feel her strength ebbing, her vision starting to blur around the edges. But with her free hand, she managed to pull one stick of dynamite from the bag. "You know what I find liberating?" she gasped. "Not having to listen to megalomaniac speeches." She bit down on the fuse, lighting it with the flame from the oil lantern she'd somehow managed to hold onto. The dynamite sputtered to life, burning fast and bright. The creature's eyes widened, and for the first time it showed something like concern. "You would bring down the entire chamber? You'll kill us all, including the child? Better than letting you loose on the world," Leona said through gritted teeth. But even as she spoke, she could see Emma on the altar, still Emma despite the thing's influence. Still a 7-year-old girl who deserved a chance to grow up and live her life. The fuse was burning quickly. Maybe 10 seconds before the dynamite exploded, Carter, still struggling in the creature's grip, caught her eye and nodded toward a narrow crack in the chamber wall she hadn't noticed before. "The old drainage tunnel," he shouted. "It leads to the surface." The creature holding Carter suddenly released him, all three of the transformed beings flowing toward Leona with inhuman speed. But they were too late. The fuse had burned down to almost nothing. Leona made her choice. Instead of holding onto the dynamite, she hurled it toward the chamber's ceiling, away from Emma and the altar. The explosion, when it came, brought down a section of roof, but left the main chamber intact. In the chaos of falling rock and billowing dust, Carter grabbed Emma from the altar, while Leona snatched up his fallen revolver. The ancient creature roared in fury, its voice shaking loose stones from what remained of the ceiling. The drainage tunnel! Carter yelled, carrying Emma toward the crack in the wall. They squeezed through the narrow opening, just as the creature's claws raked the stone where they had been standing. The tunnel beyond was barely wide enough for a grown person, sloping upward at a steep angle toward what looked like daylight far above. Behind them, the creature's voice followed, no longer cultured and reasonable, but filled with ancient rage. "You cannot escape. This mountain is mine, and everything in it belongs to me." But as they climbed toward the light, Emma stirred in Carter's arms, her eyes clearing for the first time since they'd found her. "Miss Leona," she whispered, "I had such strange dreams. Maybe they could escape after all." But even as hope flickered to life, Leona knew the ancient creature wasn't going to give up easily. They had wounded it, embarrassed it, stolen its prize. And something that had waited centuries for freedom wouldn't let a little thing like a cave-in stop its plans. The real fight was just beginning. The drainage tunnel emerged behind a screen of mountain laurel, about halfway up the ridge from Leona's cabin. They stumbled into the afternoon sunlight, gasping and covered in stone dust, with Emma clinging to Carter's neck like a frightened kitten. "We need to get to town," Carter said, setting Emma gently on her feet. "Warn people about what's down there. Won't do any good." Leona checked the revolver's cylinder. 4 bullets left. "Those fake lawmen this morning? They're part of whatever company hired you. They'll have the real authorities convinced we're the dangerous ones." Emma looked up at them with eyes that were mercifully, completely human again.
"Where's Papa?"
"He said he was coming to find me, but then I got lost in the dark place." Leona knelt beside the little girl, choosing her words carefully. "Your papa got hurt, sweetheart. But we're going to take you somewhere safe, and then we'll figure out how to help him." It wasn't exactly a lie. Samuel Tucker was beyond help in any conventional sense, but there might still be a way to free him from whatever had taken control of his body. "The binding ritual," Carter said, as if reading her thoughts. "That creature said each sacrifice weakened the barriers. Maybe if we can reverse the process." A sound like thunder rolled up from the depths of the mountain, followed by the crash of falling stone. The ancient creature wasn't taking their escape quietly. "We need supplies," Leona said. "Food, ammunition, more explosives. If we're going to fight this thing properly, we need to be prepared." They made their way back to the cabin, moving carefully through the forest and watching for signs of the transformed creatures. The building looked undisturbed from the outside, but when they stepped onto the porch, Leona could smell something wrong. A sickly, sweet odor like flowers left too long in water. Inside, they found the cabin exactly as they'd left it, except for one addition. Lying on the kitchen table was a child's torn dress, muddy and stained with something dark. Emma's dress from when she'd first disappeared. "How did that get here?" Carter asked. "Message," Leona said grimly. "They want us to know they can reach us anywhere." Emma stared at the dress with wide eyes. "That's what I was wearing when I went to look for Papa, but I don't remember taking it off." Leona gathered supplies quickly, more ammunition for both the rifle and revolver, dried food that would keep, a second oil lantern, and her grandfather's complete cache of dynamite. As she worked, she could feel eyes watching from the forest, but when she looked through the windows, she saw nothing. "There's something else," Carter said, studying her grandfather's journal again. "These final entries. Your grandfather mentions a man named Iron Bear, says he was the one who warned them about the sealed chamber in the first place. Iron Bear was a Ute elder. My grandfather mentioned him sometimes, said he was one of the few native people who still lived in these mountains after the territory was settled." Leona paused in her packing. "But that was 40 years ago. He'd be long dead by now. Maybe. Or maybe his people passed down more than just warnings." Carter showed her a page near the back of the journal. Look at this. Written in her grandfather's careful script was a detailed drawing of the symbols they'd seen in the chamber, along with what looked like translation notes. Iron Bear says, "The markings tell a story," Leona read aloud. Long ago, his people fought something that came from the deep places. They couldn't destroy it, but they could bind it, keep it sleeping. The symbols are both warning and instruction for those who know how to read them. Emma tugged on Leona's sleeve. Miss Leona, there are people coming up the trail. Through the window, they could see a group of riders approaching, the same fake lawmen from that morning, but now accompanied by several other men in city clothes. At their head rode a tall man in an expensive suit, his bearing suggesting he was used to being in charge. Josiah Blackwood, Carter said, his voice flat with recognition. The man who hired me. They watched as the riders spread out around the cabin, surrounding it with military precision. These weren't just hired guns. They moved like men with training and experience in violence. Blackwood dismounted and approached the porch, flanked by two of his men. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of wealth and position. "Mrs. Briggs, I apologize for the intrusion. I'm Josiah Blackwood, representing the Colorado Mining Consortium. I understand you've encountered our former employee, Mr. Vance." "He's not here," Leona called through the door. "I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate. We tracked him to your property, and given his wounded condition, he couldn't have gone far." Blackwood's tone remained polite, but there was steel underneath. "We're prepared to offer you substantial compensation for any inconvenience he may have caused." Carter moved to the window, staying out of sight, but positioning himself for a clear shot. "He's stalling," he whispered. "Probably has men moving around to the back. Mr. Vance discovered something in our mining operation that could be dangerous to public safety." Blackwood continued. "We need to ensure that information doesn't spread unnecessarily." "What kind of information?" Leona asked, playing for time while she finished loading the dynamite into her pack. "Technical details about geological instability, the kind of thing that could cause a panic if misunderstood by laypeople." Blackwood stepped closer to the door. "We simply want to contain the situation before anyone gets hurt." A shadow moved past the back window, one of Blackwood's men trying to get into position. Carter raised his revolver but held his fire. "The thing is, Mr. Blackwood," Leona said, shouldering her rifle, "I think people are already getting hurt. 3 disappearances in 2 weeks, and now you show up with an army. That doesn't sound like a mining survey to me." The polite mask slipped from Blackwood's voice. "Mrs. Briggs, I'm trying to handle this diplomatically, but I have investors to answer to, and this project is too important to be derailed by—" His words were cut off by a roar that echoed up from the mine shaft, so loud it shook dust from the cabin's rafters. The horses outside shied and whinnied in terror, and several of Blackwood's men reached for their weapons. "What in God's name was that?" one of them shouted. Blackwood's face had gone pale, but he quickly regained his composure. "Controlled blasting, part of our excavation process." Another roar, closer this time, and the ground actually trembled under their feet. Through the windows, they could see shapes moving in the forest, the transformed creatures emerging from the mine, drawn by the presence of so many potential victims. "I don't think those are your employees." "Mr. Blackwood," Leona said. The first creature stepped into the clearing, and Blackwood's horses panicked completely. The animals reared and bucked, throwing their riders and scattering in all directions. The men scrambled for cover, drawing their guns and firing wildly at targets they didn't understand. "What have you done?" Blackwood screamed, his composure finally cracking. "They weren't supposed to come up during daylight." "So you do know what they are," Carter said, emerging onto the porch with his revolver ready. "Controlled specimens," Blackwood said desperately. "Manageable assets. The creature below was supposed to remain dormant until we completed the extraction process." More creatures poured from the forest, moving with that same fluid grace, but now showing signs of agitation. The gunfire from Blackwood's men was having little effect. Most of their shots went wide, and even direct hits only slowed the creatures down. "Extraction of what?" Leona demanded. "The biological material," Blackwood said. Tissue samples from the entity below. My clients believe it holds the key to extending human life indefinitely. But the process requires living subjects for... His explanation was cut short as one of the creatures reached him. Blackwood tried to run, but the thing moved faster, wrapping long arms around his chest and lifting him off his feet. "Help me," he screamed. "The binding ritual. You have to complete the binding ritual." But his words were lost in the chaos as more creatures emerged from the mine, drawn by the sounds of conflict. The clearing became a battlefield, with Blackwood's men firing desperately at targets that seemed immune to conventional weapons. Emma pressed close to Leona's side, trembling but not panicking. "Miss Leona, the bad dreams are coming back. I can hear them calling." Through the noise and confusion, Leona realized the little girl was right. The creatures weren't just randomly attacking. They were trying to reclaim Emma, drawn by whatever connection had been forged during her time in the chamber. And deep below, something ancient and hungry was starting to climb toward the surface. The battle in the clearing was chaos incarnate. Blackwood's hired guns fired desperately at the transformed creatures, their bullets finding marks but having little lasting effect. The creatures moved through the gunfire like dancers, their elongated forms flowing between the muzzle flashes. "We need to get Emma away from here," Carter said, reloading his revolver with his last few bullets. "They're not after us, they're after her." Leona could see he was right. The creatures moved through Blackwood's men with casual violence, tossing them aside or striking them down. But their attention kept returning to the cabin where Emma huddled against the doorframe. "The back trail," Leona said. "We can reach the old logging road if we move fast." But even as she spoke, more shapes emerged from the forest behind the cabin. They were surrounded, with the creatures forming an ever-tightening circle around the building. Blackwood, still struggling in the grip of one of the creatures, managed to shout over the chaos. "The binding stones! They're the key! You have to destroy the binding stones." "What binding stones?" Carter called back. "The altar, the symbols. They're carved into special stones quarried from deep below. Destroy them and the entity loses its anchor to this realm." One of the creatures holding Blackwood turned its attention to his words, and its grip tightened. The man's words cut off in a strangled gasp, but the damage was done. Now they knew there was a way to fight back. "Emma," Leona said gently, kneeling beside the frightened girl, "I need you to be very brave. We're going to run, and I need you to stay close to me no matter what happens." Emma nodded, her small hand gripping Leona's with surprising strength. "The bad dreams are getting stronger, Miss Leona." He's coming up from the deep place, as if summoned by her words. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Dust sifted down from the cabin's rafters, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the sound of stone cracking under immense pressure. "He's breaking free from the chamber," Carter said grimly. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." Leona shouldered her pack and rifle. "The dynamite might bring down enough rock to trap him below, but we'd have to get back to the chamber to place it properly." "Through all of them?" Carter gestured toward the creatures surrounding the cabin. "Not through them. Under them." Leona pulled out her grandfather's journal, flipping to a page she'd noticed earlier. "The old mine has a secondary shaft, an air vent that connects to the main tunnel system. It's narrow, but it might be passable." The trembling in the ground grew stronger, and several of the creatures suddenly turned away from the cabin, as if hearing some inaudible summons. They began moving back toward the mine entrance, flowing through the forest like a retreating tide. "He's calling them back," Emma whispered. "He needs them for the big ritual." "What big ritual?" Leona asked. Emma's eyes had taken on that distant look again, as if she was seeing something far away. "He showed me in the dreams. When he comes to the surface, he's going to change everyone at once. Make them all like Papa, like the others. He needs the binding stones on top, not just below." Carter and Leona exchanged glances. "You mean there are more binding stones? Not just the ones in the chamber? The whole mountain is one big ritual circle," Emma said in a voice too old for her years. "He's been preparing for decades, moving the stones piece by piece. Tonight, when the moon is dark, he'll complete the binding. The ground shook again, harder this time, and they could hear the sound of massive stones shifting deep below. Whatever was climbing up from the sealed chamber was powerful enough to move tons of rock. "The air shaft," Leona said urgently. "Where is it?" According to her grandfather's notes, the secondary shaft opened about 200 yards north of the main mine entrance, concealed by a copse of aspen trees. If they could reach it without being detected, they might be able to get back into the tunnel system and reach the binding stones before the ancient creature completed its ritual. But first, they had to get out of the cabin alive. The creatures had mostly withdrawn, but several still lurked in the forest around the clearing. Blackwood's men were either dead or had fled, leaving their employer still trapped in the grip of one of the transformed beings. The man was unconscious now, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. "He's alive," Carter observed. "They want him alive for some reason. The ritual probably requires willing participants," Leona said. "Or at least living ones." They slipped out the back door of the cabin, moving as quietly as possible through the gathering dusk. The air shaft was exactly where her grandfather's journal said it would be, a circular opening about 4 feet across. Partially concealed by fallen logs and years of accumulated debris, it goes straight down for maybe 30 feet, and then angles toward the main tunnel, Leona said, consulting the journal. "My grandfather used it to test air quality in the mine." Carter peered into the darkness below. "It's going to be a tight fit. Better than facing those things in open ground." Leona tied a rope around a sturdy aspen and dropped the other end into the shaft. "I'll go first, then Emma, then you." The descent was harrowing. The shaft was barely wide enough for an adult, and the walls were slick with decades of moisture. But they managed to reach the bottom without incident, emerging into a narrow tunnel that connected to the main mine system. The air down here felt different than it had that morning. Thicker, almost alive with malevolent energy. Strange lights flickered in the distance, and they could hear the sound of chanting echoing through the tunnels. "They're already starting," Emma whispered. "The big ritual. Can you hear them singing?" Leona could indeed hear something, voices raised in unison, speaking words in a language that predated human settlement of these mountains. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the stone. They followed the tunnel toward the main chamber, moving as quietly as possible. Along the way, they passed several smaller chambers that Leona didn't remember from her grandfather's descriptions. These were newer excavations, carved with the same precise technique as the original sealed chamber. "Blackwood's people have been busy," Carter observed. "This isn't just mining. It's archaeological excavation." In one of the chambers, they found stacks of crates marked with corporate logos and shipping dates. The contents were carefully catalogued, stone tablets covered with symbols, artifacts that looked far older than any Native American relics, and glass containers filled with something that glowed with the same pale light as the creature's eyes. Tissue samples, Leona realized. They've been harvesting pieces of that thing for months and selling them to the highest bidder. Carter examined one of the shipping manifests. "This is going to clients all over the world. Pharmaceutical companies, research institutions, private collectors." The chanting grew louder as they approached the main chamber, and Emma began to tremble. "He knows we're here," she whispered. "He can feel me coming back." Through the tunnel opening, they could see the chamber had been transformed. The binding stones from the altar had been moved, arranged in a perfect circle around the wrapped figure that was no longer wrapped. The ancient creature stood at the center of the circle, no longer withered and decrepit, but somehow more solid, more present in the world. Around the circle stood dozens of the transformed beings, not just the recent victims like Samuel Tucker, but older converts, people who had been missing for years. They chanted in unison, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to resonate through the very stone. And there, at the edge of the circle, was Josiah Blackwood. He was conscious now, but his eyes held the same glassy stare as the other transformed beings. The change had already begun. "We're too late," Carter said. "The ritual's almost complete." But Leona was studying the arrangement of the binding stones, comparing them to the diagrams in her grandfather's journal. "Not quite," she said. "Look at the pattern. They're missing the keystone, the central piece that focuses the binding energy." Emma suddenly straightened, her eyes clearing. "I know where it is," she said. "He showed me in the dreams. It's the stone Papa found when he was looking for the lost cattle. The one that made him start coming down here in the first place. The keystone. Without it, the ritual couldn't be completed. But with it, the ancient creature would have enough power to extend its influence far beyond the mountain, transforming everyone within miles into servants of the deep places. And somewhere in the darkness, the keystone was waiting to be found. Emma led them through a maze of tunnels that didn't appear on any of her grandfather's maps. These passages were older, carved with the same precise technique as the sealed chamber, but following the natural contours of the mountain. Strange symbols covered the walls, not the binding markings they'd seen before, but something else entirely. "These are warnings," Emma said, her small fingers tracing the carved lines. "The first people who lived here, they tried to tell everyone what was sleeping below, but nobody listened. The chanting from the main chamber grew fainter as they moved deeper into the mountain, following passages that spiraled downward into the earth's heart. The air grew warmer, and a faint red glow emanated from somewhere ahead. "How do you know where we're going?" Carter asked. "Papa showed me before the bad thing took him over completely. He found the keystone in the deep place where the earth bleeds fire." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. "He thought it was pretty, so he brought it up to show Mama. But when he touched it, the dreams started. They emerged into a vast natural cavern, far larger than the ritual chamber above. The red glow came from veins of some mineral in the walls, not quite crystal, not quite metal, but something that pulsed with its own inner light. At the center of the cavern, surrounded by a pool of water that steamed in the warm air, sat a pillar of black stone, and embedded in the top of that pillar was the keystone, a piece of the same material as the binding stones, but larger and more intricately carved. The symbols on its surface seemed to move and shift in the red light, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. "There it is," Emma said simply. Carter started toward the pillar, but Leona caught his arm. "Wait, something's wrong here." She was right. The cavern was too perfect, too obviously a focal point for whatever power slept in the mountain. And the keystone sat there unguarded, as if waiting for someone to claim it. "It's a trap," she realized. "That creature, it wants us to take the keystone." Emma nodded solemnly. "He needs someone to carry it to the circle. Someone who isn't changed yet. The keystone won't work if one of his servants touches it." "Then we leave it here," Carter said. "Without the keystone, the ritual can't be completed." "But the ritual's already started," Emma pointed out. "If it's not completed properly, the binding energy will collapse inward. The whole mountain will explode." Leona stared at the little girl. "How do you know that?" "Because he told me. In the dreams. He's been planning this for a very long time, Miss Leona. Even if he doesn't get what he wants, he won't let anyone else win either." The implications hit them both at the same time. The ancient creature had set up a no-win scenario. If they completed the ritual by bringing the keystone to the circle, it would gain the power to transform the entire territory. If they didn't complete the ritual, the unstable binding energy would destroy everything for miles around. "There has to be another way," Carter said desperately. Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring at the keystone with eyes that held far too much knowledge for a 7-year-old. "There is," she said finally. "But you're not going to like it. Tell us. The binding ritual isn't just about controlling the creature. It's about keeping the deep places sealed. My people, Papa's people and yours too, they've been guarding this mountain for generations, making sure the old things stay buried." Leona felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cavern's temperature. "Your grandfather never told you about his real job, did he?" "What do you mean?" Emma turned to face them, and for a moment she looked far older than her years. "Your grandfather wasn't just a miner, Miss Leona. He was a guardian. His family's been watching over this place since before the territory was settled. Just like Papa's family, just like mine, the pieces began falling into place in Leona's mind. Her grandfather's detailed knowledge of the mine, his warnings about doors that shouldn't be opened, the way he'd reacted when she'd played near the mine entrance as a child. The sealed chamber, she said slowly. He didn't seal it to hide the creature. He sealed it to keep it sleeping. And every generation, when the seals start to weaken, someone from the guardian families has to renew them. Emma's voice was sad but determined. That's why the creature needed fresh blood for the ritual. It knew the old bindings were failing. Carter looked between them, understanding dawning in his eyes. But if the guardian families are supposed to maintain the seals, why did Blackwood's company get involved? Because there's only one of me left, Emma said simply. Papa was the last of his line, and when the creature took him, there was nobody else. The seals have been failing for months. Leona knelt beside Emma, her heart breaking for this brave little girl who'd been carrying such an enormous burden. That's why you didn't really fight when the creature called you down into the tunnels. You knew what had to be done, Emma nodded. But I was scared. I'm still scared. The ritual requires... She couldn't finish the sentence. It requires a willing sacrifice from the guardian bloodlines, Carter said grimly. Someone who chooses to die to maintain the seals. But there's another way, Emma said quickly. Your grandfather wrote about it in his journal. If both bloodlines work together, if we combine our power, we can reset the entire binding network, make it stronger than it's ever been. Leona pulled out her grandfather's journal, flipping through pages she'd never paid attention to before. Hidden among the mundane mining records were careful notes about ritual procedures, bloodline obligations, and something called the Great Binding. The Great Binding requires the willing cooperation of both guardian families, she read aloud. When performed correctly, it creates a permanent seal that cannot be broken by anything short of the end of the world itself. But the cost... She stopped reading, her face pale. What? Carter demanded. What's the cost? The Great Binding requires the willing sacrifice of the current generation of guardians. Their life force becomes part of the seal, ensuring it will hold for all time. Emma took Leona's hand. We both have to die, Miss Leona, but if we do it right, the bad thing will never be able to hurt anyone again. The cavern was quiet, except for the soft bubbling of the hot spring and the distant sound of chanting from above. Carter sat heavily on a boulder, the weight of the situation settling over him like a physical blow. There has to be another way, he said again, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe there is. Leona was studying the journal more carefully now, reading sections she'd skipped before. My grandfather mentioned something called the false binding, a ritual that appears to give the creature what it wants, but actually strengthens the seals instead. How? By feeding it corrupted power instead of pure guardian blood. If we can trick it into accepting tainted energy from someone who's already been partially transformed. She stopped, looking at Carter with sudden understanding. What? He asked. You were in that chamber for hours when you first surveyed it. You breathed the air, touched the binding stones, came into contact with the creature's influence. Leona's voice was urgent now. You're already partially changed, aren't you? That's why you could see the creatures in the forest, why you knew they weren't human. Carter was quiet for a long moment, then slowly rolled up his sleeve. Where the creature had grabbed his arm that morning, dark veins were spreading under his skin, following the path of his blood vessels. How long do I have? He asked quietly. I don't know, but maybe long enough. Leona turned to Emma. If Carter carries the keystone to the ritual circle, and we perform the false binding instead of the true one, the creature will be trapped forever, but we'll live, Emma finished. Papa will live too, once the corruption is cleansed from his blood. It wasn't a perfect solution. Carter would still die from the transformation, and there was no guarantee the false binding would actually work. But it was better than the alternatives. I'll do it, Carter said simply. Better than letting that thing loose on the world. Emma looked up at him with eyes full of gratitude and sorrow. You're very brave, Mr. Carter. No, he said, lifting the keystone from its resting place. The moment his fingers touched the carved surface, The dark veins under his skin began to pulse with the same pale light as the creature's eyes. "I'm just a man who made too many bad choices. This is the first good one I've made in years." As they made their way back through the tunnels toward the ritual chamber, Leona couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than they understood. The creature had been planning this for decades, maybe centuries. Was it really possible to outwit something that ancient and cunning? But as they approached the main chamber, where the chanting had reached a fevered pitch, she realized they were about to find out. The real battle was about to begin. The ancient creature sensed their approach long before they reached the ritual chamber. Its voice echoed through the tunnels, no longer the cultured tones it had used earlier, but something primal and hungry. "Come, guardian child. Come, tainted one. Bring me what I require, and I will make your deaths swift." Carter's transformation was accelerating. The dark veins had spread up his arm and across his chest, and his eyes reflected light with the same pale glow as the creature's servants. But his mind remained his own, at least for now. "How much time do we have?" Leona asked, checking her rifle one final time. "Not long." Carter's voice was strained, as if speaking required enormous effort. "I can feel it calling to me, trying to take control. The keystone makes it stronger." Emma stayed close to Leona's side, her small hand gripping the woman's jacket. "Remember, when we get to the circle, I have to speak the old words. The ones in the Guardian language. Don't try to stop me, even if it looks like I'm helping the bad thing." They reached the tunnel entrance to the main chamber and peered inside. The scene had changed dramatically since their last visit. The ritual circle was complete now, with the ancient creature standing at its center, surrounded by the other binding stones. The transformed beings, dozens of them, knelt in concentric circles around the altar, their voices raised in that haunting chant. Josiah Blackwood stood at the creature's right hand, his transformation complete. Where once he had been a man driven by greed and ambition, now he was something else entirely, taller, leaner, with the same elongated proportions as the other servants. When he spoke, his voice harmonized perfectly with the chanting. "The keystone approaches, Master. The binding will be complete." "Yes," the creature hissed. "And with it my children will walk freely in the world above. Every town, every city, every isolated farmstead will bow before the power of the deep places." Leona studied the arrangement of the binding stones, comparing it to the diagrams in her grandfather's journal. The false binding required a specific modification to the ritual circle. One stone had to be turned counterclockwise, and the chant had to include words from the Guardian language instead of the creature's ancient tongue. "Can you reach that stone?" she whispered to Carter, pointing to the one on the far side of the circle. He nodded, though the effort seemed to cost him. "But the moment I enter the circle, it'll know what we're planning. Not if you act like you're bringing the keystone willingly." Leona turned to Emma. "Are you ready?" The little girl took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders with courage that belied her years. "I'm ready, Miss Leona." They stepped into the chamber together, and immediately every head turned toward them. The chanting faltered for a moment, then resumed with renewed intensity as the creature's eyes fixed on the keystone in Carter's hands. "Welcome, guardian child," the creature said, its voice filled with anticipation. "Welcome, willing sacrifice. You have done well to bring me what I require." Emma walked forward with steady steps, her chin raised defiantly. "I bring you the keystone freely given, as the old compact demands. But I claim the right to speak the completion words." The creature's eyes narrowed. "You would dare to dictate terms to me, child?" "The guardian blood requires it," Emma said firmly. "The compact between your kind and mine has held for centuries, because both sides honored its terms. You want the keystone? You accept the guardian's right to speak the binding words." Leona held her breath. Everything depended on the creature's arrogance, its certainty that no mere child could outwit something that had been planning this moment for decades. The creature considered for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. Speak your words, guardian child." Let them be the last you ever utter. Carter began moving around the circle, ostensibly taking his position for the ritual, but actually heading toward the stone they needed to turn. The dark veins under his skin pulsed brighter with each step, and Leona could see him fighting against the creature's influence with every ounce of will he possessed. Emma raised her hands and began to speak, her voice clear and strong despite her fear. But instead of the words the creature expected, she spoke in the Guardian language, syllables that seemed to resonate through the stone itself. I call upon the blood of the Watchers, the sacrifice of the Guardians. The compact made in the deep time when the world was young. The creature's expression began to change as it realized what was happening. "Stop," it commanded. "Those are not the words of binding." "They are the words of binding," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "The true binding, not the false one you've been planning." Carter reached the designated stone and began to turn it, his movements slow and deliberate. The moment it shifted from its original position, the entire chamber seemed to pulse with different energy. The chanting of the transformed beings became discordant, their voices no longer harmonizing properly. "What are you doing?" The creature roared, its form beginning to waver as the ritual's focus shifted. "We're setting things right," Leona said, raising her rifle. "The way they should have been from the beginning." The creature lunged toward Emma, but the shifting energy of the circle held it back. The binding stones were no longer channeling power toward its liberation. Instead, they were drawing energy from it, pulling the entity back toward the deep places where it belonged. But the ritual wasn't complete. Carter collapsed beside the turned stone, his transformation finally overwhelming him. The keystone rolled from his grasp, coming to rest just outside the circle's perimeter. "The keystone," Emma called out desperately. "It has to be placed on the center altar, or the binding won't hold." The creature's servants were moving now, no longer frozen by the ritual's power. They flowed toward the keystone, trying to retrieve it for their master. Leona's rifle cracked repeatedly, dropping several of the transformed beings, but there were too many of them. Samuel Tucker, or the thing that had been Samuel, reached the keystone first. But as his clawed fingers closed around it, something unexpected happened. For just a moment his eyes cleared, and Leona saw the real Samuel looking out. "Emma!" he gasped. "My little girl, forgive me." With the last of his human will, Samuel Tucker hurled the keystone directly to his daughter. Emma caught it despite its weight, staggering but staying on her feet. "The center altar," Leona shouted. "Place it on the center altar and speak the final words." But the ancient creature had broken free from the circle's restraint. It flowed toward Emma with inhuman speed, its form shifting and changing as the binding energies tore at its physical presence. "I will not be caged again," it shrieked. "I will not return to the endless dark." Emma stood her ground, the keystone clutched against her chest. "You were never meant to walk in the light," she said firmly. "The deep places are your realm. Return to them now and sleep." She raised the keystone above her head and brought it down on the center altar with all her strength. The carved stone shattered into 1,000 pieces, each fragment glowing with the same pale light as the creature's eyes. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The binding stones around the circle began to crack and crumble, releasing centuries of stored energy in brilliant flashes of light. The creature's scream shook the entire mountain, and chunks of rock began falling from the chamber's ceiling. "The whole place is coming down," Leona realized. "We need to get out of here." But Emma stood motionless at the center of the collapsing circle, her arms outstretched as if embracing some invisible force. Light poured from her eyes and mouth, and her voice echoed with power that seemed to come from the mountain itself. "By guardian blood and guardian will, by the compact made in the deep time, I bind you to the depths forever. Sleep now and wake no more." The creature's form began to dissolve, pulled downward by forces beyond human understanding. Its last words echoed through the chamber as it disappeared into the cracking stone. "This is not ended, guardian child. Others will come. Others will seek what I have guarded. Then it was gone, drawn back into whatever deep realm had spawned it. The transformed beings collapsed as one, their connection to the entity severed. Some, like Samuel Tucker, drew breath again as the corruption left their bodies. Others, too far gone, crumbled to dust. The chamber continued to shake and crack, but the worst of the collapse seemed to be centered on the ritual circle itself. Emma still stood at the center, but the light was fading from her eyes, and she swayed on her feet. Leona ran to her, scooping up the little girl just as the center altar finally gave way, opening a chasm that led down into impenetrable darkness. "Is it over?" Emma whispered as they ran for the tunnel entrance. "It's over," Leona assured her, though she couldn't shake the creature's final words. Others would come, seeking the power that had been bound beneath the mountain. The guardian families might be needed again someday, but for now they had won. The immediate threat was ended, and the people of the territory were safe. Behind them, the chamber collapsed completely, sealing the deep places once and for all. Or so they hoped. The tunnel shook violently as they ran, loose stones raining down from the ceiling with each step. Behind them, the sound of the collapsing chamber echoed like thunder, followed by something else, a deep, resonant crack that seemed to come from the very bones of the mountain. "The seals are resetting," Emma gasped as Leona carried her through the narrow passage. "The mountain is healing itself." They reached the air shaft they'd used to enter the mine system, but when Leona looked up, she could see that the opening had partially collapsed. Rocks and debris blocked most of the passage, leaving only a narrow gap that might be too small for an adult to squeeze through. "Can you climb up there?" Leona asked Emma, setting her down carefully. The little girl nodded, though she looked exhausted from the ritual. "What about you?" "I'll find another way out. But you need to get to the surface and warn people about what happened here. Tell them the mine is sealed permanently. No one should ever try to open it again." Emma looked up at the narrow opening, then back at Leona. "You saved me." "Miss Leona, you and Mr. Carter." At the mention of Carter's name, Leona felt a pang of grief. He had died as he'd lived in recent years, fighting against the consequences of his past mistakes. But in the end, he'd chosen to do the right thing, and that choice had saved them all. "He was a good man when it mattered," she said simply. Emma began climbing up the air shaft, a small size, allowing her to navigate the partially blocked passage. Leona watched until she disappeared through the opening, then turned back toward the mine tunnels. The main passage was blocked by fallen rock. But she remembered seeing other tunnels during their explorations, older passages that might lead to different exits. She retraced their steps, following her memory and the fading light of her oil lantern. The mountain continued to settle around her, the deep, crackling sounds growing fainter as the broken seals reformed themselves. Whatever power had been released when Emma shattered the keystone was working to heal the damage, sealing the deep places more thoroughly than they had ever been sealed before. She found a side tunnel that sloped upward, its walls carved with the same warning symbols they'd seen throughout the mine system. This passage was older than the others, possibly carved by the original inhabitants of the mountain, the people who had first encountered the entity in the deep places and learned how to bind it. The tunnel opened into a natural cave system, and Leona could feel fresh air moving through the passages. Following the airflow, she climbed steadily upward, her lantern casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. It was nearly dawn when she finally emerged from a cave mouth she'd never seen before, hidden behind a screen of pine trees on the mountain's eastern slope. The valley spread out below her, peaceful and quiet in the early morning light. Smoke rose from chimneys in the distant town, and she could see farmers beginning their daily work. Normal life, continuing as if nothing had happened, as if an ancient evil hadn't almost been unleashed upon the world. She made her way down the mountainside, following deer trails and logging paths toward her cabin. The building stood exactly as she'd left it, though the clearing around it showed signs of the previous day's battle. Scorch marks on the ground where muzzle flashes had lit the darkness. Scattered equipment abandoned by Blackwood's men, and sitting on her front porch wrapped in a blanket and looking very small. "Was Emma Tucker? How did you—" Leona began. "Papa brought me here," Emma said simply. "The real Papa, not the changed one. He's himself again, Miss Leona." The binding worked. Samuel Tucker emerged from the cabin, moving slowly but clearly human once more. The elongated proportions were gone, the pale glow absent from his eyes. He looked older than Leona remembered, worn down by his experience, but undeniably alive and himself. "Mrs. Briggs," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did, for bringing Emma home." "She brought herself home," Leona said. "She was braver than any of us." Samuel knelt beside his daughter, pulling her close. "I remember some of it," he said quietly. "The things I did while that creature controlled me. The people I—" He couldn't finish. "That wasn't you," Leona said firmly. "That was the entity's corruption. You're not responsible for what it made you do. Others won't see it that way. Then we'll make sure they understand what really happened here." Leona sat down, heavily in her grandfather's rocking chair, feeling the weight of the past day settling over her like a physical burden. "The authorities will need to know about Blackwood's operation, about the mining company's involvement." "Blackwood's dead," Samuel said. "I saw him fall when the chamber collapsed. Most of his men too. The ones who survived have scattered." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun climb higher over the valley. Normal sounds drifted up from below, the lowing of cattle, the distant whistle of a train, the everyday music of a world that had no idea how close it had come to transformation. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "Now we rebuild," Leona said. "We make sure the mine stays sealed, and we keep watch in case anything like this ever happens again." "The Guardian families," Samuel said. "Emma told me about the compact, about our responsibility to watch over this place. If you're willing. It's not a burden I'd wish on anyone, but—" "We're willing," Samuel said firmly. "After what I've seen, after what almost happened, how could we not be?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Besides, someone has to make sure people don't go poking around where they shouldn't." A rider appeared on the valley trail below, spurring his horse hard up the mountain path. As he drew closer, Leona recognized Tom Wilson, the deputy sheriff from Copper Creek. "Mrs. Briggs," he called out as he reached the clearing. "Thank God you're all right. When we heard about the explosion—" "Explosion?" "The whole mountainside shook last night. Folks in town thought it was an earthquake, but the old-timers said it felt more like blasting. We've been searching for survivors all morning." Leona and Samuel exchanged glances. They'd need to be careful about how much they revealed. The truth was too fantastic for most people to accept, and the fewer who knew about the deep places, the better. "Mining accident," Samuel said. "That company that's been surveying the area, their explosives got away from them. Anyone hurt?" "Several men were killed," Leona said truthfully. "The company supervisor, Josiah Blackwood, and most of his crew. The mine entrance is completely sealed now, too dangerous to attempt any kind of rescue." Deputy Wilson nodded grimly. "We'll need to file a report with the territorial authorities. This kind of industrial accident, there'll be an investigation." "Of course. We'll cooperate fully." After the deputy left, carrying news of the mining accident back to town, the three of them began the task of cleaning up the aftermath. They buried the equipment and personal effects of Blackwood's men, erasing as much evidence as possible of what had really happened. The mine entrance itself was completely sealed, just as Leona had told the deputy. Where once there had been a dark opening in the hillside, now there was only solid rock, as if the tunnel had never existed. "The mountain healed itself," Emma observed. "Just like you said it would." "Not healed," Leona corrected. "Protected. There's a difference." As the day wore on, other survivors began to appear. 3 of Blackwood's men who had fled during the battle emerged from the forest, their memories strangely hazy about exactly what they'd encountered. They spoke of wild animals and equipment failures, but nothing about transformed creatures or ancient entities. The binding affects memory too, Samuel realized. It's protecting itself by making people forget. By evening, they had accounted for everyone except Carter Vance. His body was never found, lost somewhere in the collapsed tunnel system. Officially, he would be listed as a victim of the mining accident, another casualty of Blackwood's reckless operation. But Leona knew better. Carter had chosen his fate, trading his life to help them save the world from an ancient evil. He deserved to be remembered as a hero, even if no one else would ever know what he'd done. As the sun set over the valley, Emma fell asleep, curled up in her father's arms, exhausted by her ordeal, but safe at last. Samuel carried her to Leona's spare room, then returned to the porch where Leona sat watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. "What you did today," he said quietly, "taking responsibility for a child who wasn't even yours, risking everything to save people you barely knew, that takes a special kind of courage." "I had help," Leona reminded him. "From you, from Emma, from Carter. We all chose to do the right thing when it mattered. Still, Emma and I, we owe you a debt we can never repay. You don't owe me anything. We're family now, in a way. Guardian families have to stick together." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the mountain. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate, and small creatures rustled through the underbrush. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the music of a world that would never know how close it had come to ending. The ancient evil was bound once more, sealed away in the deep places where it belonged. But Leona knew that vigilance would be required for generations to come. Other Blackwoods would appear, drawn by legends of power hidden in the mountain. Other entities might stir in the depths, testing the strength of the seals when that time came. The Guardian families would be ready, 3 weeks after the mining accident. As the official report termed it, life in the Colorado Territory had settled back into its normal rhythms. The story that reached the newspapers spoke of an industrial disaster caused by improperly stored explosives, claiming the lives of mining supervisor Josiah Blackwood and several members of his survey team. The Copper Creek mine was declared permanently closed due to geological instability. Leona stood at her kitchen window, watching Emma and Samuel work in the garden behind the cabin. The little girl had thrown herself into the task of replanting the herbs that had been trampled during the battle, as if nurturing new life could help her forget the darkness she'd witnessed below ground. The official investigation had been surprisingly brief. The territorial authorities seemed eager to close the case and move on to other matters. Perhaps the binding's influence extended even to bureaucratic memory, Leona mused, making people reluctant to dig too deeply into what had happened on the mountain. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she found a woman she didn't recognize. Elderly, perhaps 70 years old, with silver hair braided in the traditional style of the local native tribes. Her clothes were a mixture of traditional and modern, and her eyes held the same deep knowledge that Leona had seen in Emma's during the ritual. "Leona Briggs?" the woman said in accented English. "Yes, my name is Mary Iron Bear. I believe you knew my grandfather." Leona's breath caught. "Iron Bear, the elder who warned my grandfather about the sealed chamber?" "The same. I've come to thank you for what you did, and to offer my people's help in maintaining the new seals." Mary Iron Bear stepped into the cabin without invitation, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever she went. Her eyes swept the room, taking in details with the practiced gaze of someone who missed nothing. "The binding is strong," she said approvingly. "Stronger than it has been in many generations. But it will require tending, as all living things do." "Living things?" "The seals are not merely stone and ritual, Mrs. Briggs. They are fed by the life force of the Guardian families, renewed by their commitment to protect what must remain hidden." Mary settled into Leona's grandfather's chair as if she'd been sitting there for years. "My people have watched over this mountain since before your people arrived. We knew the time would come when the old bindings would fail." Through the window, Leona could see Samuel teaching Emma how to properly space the herb plantings. The man had aged in the weeks since his transformation, but there was a peace in his movements that spoke of someone who had found his purpose. The Ute tribes were guardians too, Leona realized. One of several peoples who took on that responsibility. The entity you faced was not the only thing that sleeps in the deep places, Mrs. Briggs. There are others, scattered throughout the territory and beyond. Most remain safely bound, but some grow restless as the world changes around them. Mary reached into a leather pouch at her side and withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin. When she unfolded the covering, it revealed a piece of carved stone similar to the binding stones from the ritual chamber, but smaller and more intricately detailed. "This is a guardian stone," Mary explained. "It will help you sense when the seals are weakening, and it will allow you to communicate with other guardian families across great distances." Leona accepted the stone carefully. The moment her fingers touched its surface, she felt a subtle warmth and a sense of connection, not just to the mountain beneath her feet, but to other places, other people carrying similar responsibilities. "There are more of us," she breathed, "many more. The Tucker family and yours are not alone in your duties. We have maintained a network for centuries, sharing information and assistance when needed." Mary's weathered face creased in a smile. "Though I must admit, your solution to the Copper Creek problem was more dramatic than most. We did what we had to do, yes, and you did it well. The false binding you performed, that was not something taught in your grandfather's journal, was it?" Leona shook her head. "Emma figured it out. She seemed to know things that no 7-year-old should know. The guardian blood runs strong in that child. She will be a powerful protector when she comes of age." Mary stood, preparing to leave. "But for now, let her be a child. The responsibilities of guardianship are heavy enough without bearing them too early." As Mary Ironbear prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "One more thing, Mrs. Briggs. The man who died in the tunnels, Carter Vance, he chose well in his final moments. But his sacrifice created an imbalance in the binding network." "What kind of imbalance?" "His life force was absorbed by the seals along with the guardian power. It makes them stronger, but it also makes them unpredictable. You may find that the mountain responds to your presence differently now." After Mary left, Leona sat in her grandfather's chair, holding the guardian stone and thinking about the weight of responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders. Outside, Emma's laughter drifted through the window as she discovered a family of rabbits that had taken up residence in the garden. The stone in her hands pulsed gently, and for a moment she felt the presence of other guardians, distant but real, carrying their own burdens in their own corners of the world. A network of protectors, most of them ordinary people living ordinary lives, united by their commitment to keeping the ancient evils safely buried. The sun was setting when Samuel and Emma finally came inside, both of them dirty and tired, but satisfied with their work. Emma had adapted remarkably well to her new life at the cabin, though she still occasionally woke in the night with dreams of the deep places. "Miss Leona," Emma said as they washed up for dinner, "I keep thinking about what that bad thing said before it went away." "About others coming? What about it? Do you think it meant other creatures like itself? Or other people like Mr. Blackwood?" Leona considered the question carefully. In truth, both possibilities worried her. The creature's final words had suggested that there were others who knew about the power hidden beneath the mountain, others who might seek to claim it for themselves. "Probably both," she said honestly. "But that's why we're here, to watch and to be ready if anything like this happens again." Emma nodded solemnly. "The guardian families," Leona agreed. That night, after Samuel and Emma had gone to bed, Leona sat on her porch with the guardian stone in her hands, feeling its connection to the network of protectors scattered across the continent. Some were dealing with their own challenges, a stirring in an old burial ground in the Dakota Territory, strange lights beneath a lake in Minnesota, reports of missing travelers near a particular mountain pass in Wyoming. The world was full of sleeping dangers, and there were never enough people willing to stand watch over them. But somehow the network endured. Generation after generation, ordinary people chose to take on extraordinary responsibilities. Keeping the darkness at bay through courage and sacrifice, the stone pulsed again, And this time, Leona felt a specific presence, warm, familiar, and somehow reassuring. For just a moment, she could have sworn she sensed Carter Vance, his life force now part of the mountain's defenses, still standing guard over the deep places in his own way. "Thank you," she whispered to the night air. The mountain was quiet around her, peaceful and secure. The ancient evil slept once more, bound by seals that would hold for generations to come. And when the time came for those seals to be renewed or for new threats to be faced, the Guardian families would be ready. It was a heavy responsibility, but it was also a privilege. To be trusted with the safety of everyone who would never know what slept beneath their feet. To be part of something larger than herself, a tradition stretching back to the earliest days of human civilization. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the distance an owl called to its mate. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the music of a world that was safe because people like her chose to keep it that way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities. But tonight, the mountains slept peacefully, and that was enough. 5 years had passed since the mining accident that officially closed the Copper Creek mine forever. The small cemetery behind the white church in town had gained several new headstones, including one that read simply Carter Vance, 1851-1887, a man who found his way home. No one questioned why Leona Briggs had paid for the marker, or why she visited it every month with fresh wildflowers. The mountain had indeed changed in the years since the binding ritual. What Mary Iron Bear had called unpredictable had manifested in ways both subtle and profound. The forest grew more lush than it had in decades, as if the earth itself had been renewed. Springs that had run dry for years began flowing again. Game animals returned to areas they had long avoided, but there were other changes too, ones that only the Guardian families noticed. Sometimes, on nights when the moon was dark, strange lights could be seen moving deep within the mountain. Not threatening lights, but protective ones, as if Carter's spirit had indeed become part of the mountain's defenses. Leona stood in her garden, now 12 years old, helping her harvest the last of the summer herbs. The girl had grown tall and strong with her father's determination and her mother's gentle wisdom. More importantly, she had learned to control the guardian abilities that manifested as she matured, the capacity to sense disturbances in the binding network, to communicate across vast distances with other protectors, to feel the pulse of the ancient powers that slept beneath the earth. "There's a letter for you from Wyoming," Samuel called from the porch, waving an envelope that had arrived with the morning mail. Leona wiped her hands on her apron and took the letter, recognizing the careful script of another Guardian family. The network that Mary Iron Bear had introduced her to had become an integral part of her life. A community of protectors who shared information, resources, and occasionally personnel when situations arose that required multiple families working together. The letter contained news both good and concerning. The situation near the mountain pass in Wyoming had been resolved. A minor entity had been properly rebound before it could cause serious harm. But there were reports of increased activity near an old Spanish mission in New Mexico, and the Guardian family there was requesting assistance. "We might need to travel south next month," Leona told Samuel as Emma joined them on the porch. "The New Mexico situation?" Emma asked, her young face serious with understanding beyond her years. "Possibly. The Delgado family has been watching that site for 3 generations, but they're getting older, and their grandchildren haven't shown strong Guardian traits. It was a common problem in their network. The Guardian bloodlines were old, and not every generation produced children with the necessary abilities. Sometimes entire family lines died out, leaving ancient sites unprotected until new Guardians could be trained and positioned. "I could help," Emma said quietly. "I've been practicing with the focus stones Mary Iron Bear gave me. I can sense disturbances from almost 100 miles away now." Samuel looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. At 12, Emma was already more powerful than most adult guardians, but she was still a child. The network had strict rules about not exposing young guardians to serious dangers until they reached maturity. The New Mexico site is different from what we dealt with here, Leona explained gently. It's not bound the same way. The entity there is more aware, more actively malevolent. It would be too dangerous for someone your age. Emma nodded, accepting the decision with the grace she'd learned over the years. Will you teach me more about the different types of bindings while you're preparing for the trip? Of course. They settled into their afternoon routine, Emma practicing her abilities with the guardian stones, while Leona and Samuel planned for the potential journey to New Mexico. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of domestic tranquility that would have been impossible if they hadn't succeeded in their battle against the ancient entity years before. As the sun began to set, a familiar figure appeared on the trail leading up from town. Mary Iron Bear visited regularly now, serving as a liaison between the guardian families and the tribal councils that still maintained their own protective traditions. At 75, she moved with the same confident grace she'd possessed when Leona first met her. "The network sends greetings," Mary said as she joined them on the porch. "And news from the East Coast. The Boston situation has been resolved, and the Philadelphia families report all quiet in their sector." "And New Mexico?" Leona asked. "The Delgados have agreed to accept assistance. You and Samuel would be welcome there, but they understand if your own responsibilities prevent you from traveling." Leona looked around at the peaceful mountain setting, at the garden she and Emma had cultivated, at the cabin that had become home to this makeshift family. 5 years ago, she had been a solitary mountain woman with no greater concern than the changing seasons. Now she was part of something vast and important, a guardian not just of her own mountain, but of the delicate balance that kept ancient evils safely contained. "We'll go," she decided. "Emma can stay with the Hendersons in town. They've been wanting her to spend more time with their daughter anyway." Emma looked disappointed, but didn't argue. She understood the importance of the work, even if she chafed at being considered too young to fully participate. As evening settled over the mountain, they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The guardian stone in Leona's pocket pulsed gently, connecting her to the network of protectors scattered across the continent. Each pulse was a reminder that she was not alone, that others shared the burden of keeping the world safe from threats it never knew existed. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked quietly. "Taking on this responsibility?" Leona considered the question. Her life had certainly become more complicated since that foggy morning when she'd found Carter Vance bleeding beneath her grandfather's oak tree. She could have turned him in to the authorities, gone back to her quiet existence, never learned about the ancient evils sleeping beneath her mountain. But then she looked at Emma, strong and confident and growing into her power with wisdom and compassion. She thought about the network of guardians she'd come to know, ordinary people doing extraordinary things out of love for a world that would never thank them. She remembered Carter's sacrifice and the peace that had settled over the mountain since the binding was renewed. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it. This is what I was meant to do." Mary Iron Bear smiled, her weathered face creasing with approval. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said the guardian blood ran strong in his family, but he worried there would be no one to carry on the tradition after him." "There will always be someone," Emma said with quiet certainty. "As long as there are things that need guarding, there will be people willing to do it." The mountain was quiet around them, peaceful and secure. Somewhere deep below, the ancient entity slept its unnatural sleep, bound by seals that would hold for centuries to come. And if those seals ever weakened, if new threats emerged from the deep places, the guardian families would be ready. It was a legacy worth protecting, a tradition worth maintaining. And as the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, Leona Briggs knew she was exactly where she belonged, standing watch over the darkness, keeping the world safe one mountain at a time. The network would endure, the guardians would remain vigilant, and the ancient evils would stay safely buried in the deep places where they belonged. It was a promise made in blood and sacrifice, renewed with each generation, and it would hold for as long as there were people willing to stand between the darkness and the light. In the distance, an owl called to its mate, and the mountain whispered its eternal secrets to the wind. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the music of a world that slept safely because someone chose to stand guard through the night. And in that choice, in that commitment to something greater than herself, Leona Briggs had found not just purpose, but home.